Welcome to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. Today, KC Research oil and gas analyst Marin Katusa warns without new pipelines, Canada's economy will stagnate due to international competition. Venable Park Investment Council President Danielle is concerned about the Bank of Canada's lack of reserves. We talk to Marin Katusa right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600. Welcome to This Week in Money, the source for market opinions. Sitting in for Phil Mackesy, here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Marin Katusa, oil and gas analyst for KC Research. Welcome to This Week in Money, Marin.
Thanks for having me.
I saw a headline the other day that some people are predicting Canada's oil and gas industry is going to almost double over the next 15 years. And the big reason is that the Middle East and Russia are unreliable sources of energy. Do you believe that's the case?
Well, the potential is there. Without building the Keystone and the Northern Gateway, that will not happen. Yes, the Middle East is, politically vulnerable to setbacks. Russia is politically using its leverage, but they're not going to decrease their production. In fact, the Russians are increasing their production of both oil and natural gas and signed a major deal with the Chinese. But again, Canada has the potential. However, without investing in the right infrastructure, it will not be realized.
Is that going to be the biggest stumbling block for the Canadian oil and gas industry, the lack of infrastructure? I mean, now they're using rail cars like crazy.
Without a doubt. And you look at the use of rail to ship oil has increased by over 10 times over the last decade. So, there's only so much capacity on the rails. And, rail is a risky form of transporting oil where the pipelines are much safer. And more importantly is Canada needs to invest in building new pipelines because we're depending on old pipelines. For example, 15% of the existing pipelines in use were built before 1960. These pipelines were not meant to last that long, but because of all of the permitting hurdles, we're not building new, better, modern, much lower risk pipelines. Now, there's no guarantees with anything, but by having a sensible solution, Canada can be a world leader in this, and we are in the resource sector. You're always going to have setbacks, but by doing the right thing, it's the right thing for all of Canada to invest in our infrastructure.
Are people more emotional than factual when it comes to opposing pipelines? It seems every time a pipeline is proposed, the people against it, are lined up in droves.
Well, I debated, you can go on YouTube, it's got thousands and tens of thousands of video, people watched it. It was the debate with the founder of Greenpeace. And I showed up to that debate with facts, backed by the government statistics, backed by science. Rex, bless his soul, is a great man, and I have a lot of respect for him. He used emotion to get his point across. David Suzuki uses a lot of science for his validity, but uses emotion to get his message across. So my point here is that they have great points, and some of them I do agree with, but yes, you've nailed it on the head. There's a lot of misinformation and fear-mongering that is being used, where I believe that the government, the industry, and also the anti-movement to the development needs to focus on the facts and the science and put the emotion or opinion on the side.
Well, the Quebec train disaster shows just how dangerous it is to transport petroleum above ground on rail cars. I mean, derailments happen every day. We rarely hear about pipeline explosions that take out cities.
Well, because they don't. If name me a pipeline explosion that has taken out a city. The reality is you're moving these contained vessels, and the rail is being so overused right now to move the oil because the industry has no other option. On top of that, a lot of people don't know that Canadian oil trades at a big discount to American oil because we don't have the pipelines we need to not only move it south, but move it to the coast, both the east and the west. It's not just to the west to Asia, but also to the east Eastern Canada's refineries and also potentially to Europe because we don't have the infrastructure. So every Canadian is losing in this equation, and why should our oil be worth less than the American oil?
That's a good question. I think, and what's that costing the country in productivity every year?
Oh, tens of billions of dollars.
And I'm sure a lot of these people who show up for the pipeline protest probably drove there and are wearing shoes with rubber soles that were made from oil.
Well, more importantly, think of it this way. Every parent listening to this right now has their kid not in school because there's no money to pay for the union's demands for the BC teachers. I was a teacher. Before I left teaching to run the funds and do what I do today, I know the difficulty that teachers have to deal with. I know the demands of the teachers. And ironically, I don't think many teachers know that they're losing because of the infrastructure and all of this anti-movement being moved towards the development of resources, but yet there's no money from the government. But if we develop this resources, there would be more money in the government to pay the teachers what they deserve. So it's kind of like a full circle here. And ironically, a lot of the people that are preventing the development of these resources infrastructure are the same people that want the government to pay whatever the teachers want, but they are part of the problem.
Are people aware of all the advantages of having a high-tech pipeline, that they have new methods of detecting spills to make sure that they don't happen in the first place?
Exactly. You're nailing it all on the head. The new technologies are so much better. Not only the material used are better, they're safe, they're real time, so every barrel of oil is seen within the pipeline. It knows where it's going. The flow rates are controlled, the pipes. If there is a spill, and look, I'm not saying that these new pipelines are not going to have the spills, but at least they're prepared to best handle the problems. And there's always going to be a problem. Look, every person that drives a car is at risk, and things happen. You have a fender bender or, at worst, a horrific accident, and no one wants to see that, but bad things happen in anything, whether it's a construction site, in schools, in the resource sector, in the forestry sector, in the fishing sector, in the BC Transit. The point is that with the new technologies and the new infrastructure, they're better positioned to handle any negative situations.
They did do a study in BC, though, and they said if we had a major spill off the coast, we don't have the equipment here to deal with it. Is that something that industry really has to work hard at to reassure people that they do have the stuff in place to deal with possible accidents? Although double-hulled tankers have not had a major spill, and that's what we insist on oil companies using on the West Coast, double-hulled tankers.
That's correct, and I've written a lot about that in detail, and the industry has provided a lot of these safeguards, but you see the media works on taglines. They work on media clips. They need something sexy and fear-mongering because it creates attention. And nobody wants to be bored with the realities of the science. Look, as bad as everyone wants to say the Canadian resource sector is, and there was an awful accident with Imperial Mines, the reality, even with the Mount Poly situation, a lot of the problems that are happening is because of the lack of approval to develop new and better resources, whether it's new tailing ponds or new pipelines. The lack of wanting to depend more on the existing infrastructure is only going to cause more problems. If you depend on a old highway built in 1960 that's only one lane each way, you're going to have more traffic, you're going to have more potholes and more problems. Well, why not build a new highway? And that's what we're trying to do in the resource sector.
Well, in the propaganda wars against Canada's energy industry, all these films that say fracking is bad, or, this thing has been poisoned, or this pipeline is blowing up, all these films, we have found out, are funded by Mid-East oil-producing countries. In other words, they're trying to badmouth us so that they maintain their market and we don't expand ours.
Well, you're bringing a great point. I was the first one to go on national television about 2.5 years ago, because I was very early to the shale game, and talk about, wait a second, these movies, Frack Nation, the Broken Promises, the movie with the Hollywood production against this development. But then when you look at the credits, when you see Qatar LNG funding this anti-movement, when you have the Russians funding anti-European development of shale resources, it is in their best interest to see the rest of the world not develop their resources, because they make a lot of money off it. So, in reality, the shale revolution has saved America's sector today. Without the shale revolution, America has the lowest electricity costs in the world. And someone like Germany is paying 3 times more for their natural gas than Americans are. So right off the bat, when you look at a lot of the manufacturing sector, electricity is a big cost, whether it's a copper mine or a factory, an auto plant or whatever. Electricity is a big cost. So if you're already working at, low electricity costs, that competes with the very low labor of the emerging markets. And that is a big part of America's recovery. The rest of the world is going to catch on, just like Mexico is now opening up their oil sector to foreigners. The rest of the world will catch on to the innovations of the North American oil and gas sector. It's going to happen. It's going to move forward. It's better that it moves forward with the Canadian technology, and we need to keep up with the rest of the world, or we're going to lose our advantage.
Do you think sometimes Canadians, we seem to badmouth the next door neighbor who's successful? So many people are against the oil sands, and yet I think the national industry minister pointed out that the oil sands produce as much carbon dioxide as just 2 of the coal-fired plants in the United States.
There's a lot of misinformation on the oil sands, and it's a very easy thing to attack. Ironically, a lot of the people who write about this have never been up to the oil sands. They've never been to Fort McMurray. If you go up there, and the irony is that it's easy to attack, but yet you're looking at great jobs for Canadians, a better, higher standard of living for Canadians. More importantly, let's take the environment. When all of these anti-development people talk about how bad it is for the environment, when you look at the reclaimed areas, go onto Suncor's website. There's photos and scientific data showing that the reclaimed areas are now not only visually nicer, but better biological life after reclamation, after they've done their processing of the ground, than before they even started. So there's been a lot of money put into this sector. In fact, people don't even realize that Suncor has its own airline because they transport so many workers in and out of the oil patch that the oil company, the airlines never, saw that coming. And I think if you were to actually put Suncor's airplanes, it would be something like the 12th largest airline in the country. These are the innovations that these oil companies have done, and it's only going to get better.
More with Marin Katusa next on This Week in Money.
Always consult your investment professional before making any investment decision. More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600. This Week in Money is archived online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. We're speaking to Marin Katusa, oil and gas analyst for KC Research. Marin, is uranium going to be still a hot product, a hot commodity in the energy business?
Without a doubt. Uranium, has had a tough go here with Fukushima in early 2011. But the reality is 1 in every 5 homes in America, and America is the largest consumer of uranium in the world, is powered by nuclear energy. And that nuclear energy's fuel is uranium. So if you look at countries like Kazakhstan, who's the world's largest producer of uranium, they're going to be touching 60 million pounds of uranium, and they're increasing their production. Countries like Russia, which has got about half of the world's upgrading facilities and enrichment fabrication plants, they're increasing their investments and capacity. Countries like China, even Saudi Arabia, the world's largest producer of oil, they're all integrating major investments to have a diversified energy matrix, which includes nuclear energy. On top of that, you'll see Japan slowly bring back their reactors. I suspect 2 reactors by the end of this year, 4 by the end of next, and say 6 to 10 in 2016. And that's going to change the game for nuclear energy. So I think uranium, if you're a contrarian and you have a 3-year time frame, you're going to do very well.
Getting back to geopolitics and the energy business, if Canada doesn't improve its infrastructure, will the world face a riskier prospect of relying on oil and gas from Russia and the Middle East?
Well, you see, the Russian oil is not risky. It just comes with a price and a geopolitical influence. The Russians are going to continue increasing their oil production and their natural gas production. So that risk of supply is not going to go off the market. That's a big misconception that the market has. Now, the question is what about the Middle East? Well, you look at Libya, they're increasing their production even with all of the problems in the Middle East. What about Iraq? Well, Iraq's very high risk. What about Iran? Well, Iran's the second largest seller to China after Saudi Arabia and Russia. So you look at these facts and go, okay, well, there's a lot of risk there. I think the biggest risk in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia. If there is some sort of social revolution or ISIS spreads to Saudi Arabia, if that happens, then you would expect the Strait of Hormuz to shut down. That's about a third of all seaborne oil is transported through that strait. You would see oil pop to $150 to $200 overnight. That is the big question, is what happens to Saudi Arabia.
And of course, without fracking, we wouldn't be able to survive if Saudi Arabia going offline.
Well, we would be able to survive, but it would cost a lot more money. And maybe that's what needs to happen for Canada to wake up and all these protesters. When, for example, places in Europe, they spend a third of their salary on electricity, heating, and fueling up their car to drive their family around and go to work. If that same aspect happened in Canada and North America, you better believe that when it hits your wallet, people will rethink and want to know the facts of why is that happening and why are we not fracking. So the reality is North America is very rich in oil and gas. However, the cheap oil is gone, and without these horizontal drilling and fracking, we cannot get oil the amount we need. For example, in the U.S., you're looking at just over 17 million barrels a day is consumed. That's just the U.S. They still import 6 million barrels a day. Now, Canada is a big provider of that. So is Mexico. But Mexico is now decreasing their production because they haven't invested in the infrastructure. That's what happens if you don't invest back into your resources. You produce less. There's decline rates associated to this production. So without fracking, we would survive, but expect to pay twice as much.
And Canada's federal tax regime has improved, lower taxes. I mean, Burger King moving to Canada now as part of the Tim Hortons deal. But and what's more, government revenue is up from taxes after lowering them. Isn't that interesting to hear?
Well, you know, it's good for governments to finally figure it out, but don't expect the right moves from government. I've been always a big believer that governments will figure out a way to tax more and do the wrong thing. So that's just my personal opinion on politicians and government.
How realistic is it, the proposal to build a $10 billion refinery in northern BC so that instead of exporting just the raw crude, that they would be exporting the refined product?
It's an interesting perspective. I don't see the economic viability of it today, and we would have to see, more details on it. They'd have to have a long-term supply infrastructure being built, such as pipelines. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to go into place. You can't just build a refinery there, from not just the pipelines, but your distribution centers, also your resources that were delivered to there with the long-term contract. So right now it's a great idea, but that's what it is. It's an idea, it's a proposal, and it's a long way off from becoming a reality.
What Australia has done to promote its natural gas is they have the world's largest ship offshore doing the processing, so it's not on land, and they're already building which will become the world's biggest ship to accommodate that. So it's about 25 miles offshore. Would that work here in British Columbia?
Well, that ship isn't built by the Australians. It's built by Shell, and that's called floating LNG. So we call it FLNG in the industry. Shell's the one that actually invented LNG. They're the world's leader in LNG. So if you look at the largest LNG facility in the world, that's in Qatar, It's Shell that is partners with Qatar and built it for Qatar. Now, these types of resources basically are tapping into what I call stranded offshore gas deposits. There are many deposits around the world that these companies such as Shell using FLNG technology, and now just so you know, Gazprom is also building these massive, they're the biggest ships in the world, and they're a large investment, but you can basically tap into what's called stranded gas that has no market for it whatsoever. You condense it, and you know what? If the regime changes in the politics, you lift anchor and you go away elsewhere. I believe the future is FLNG. Unfortunately, there's not enough drilling in offshore Canada to prove up the deposits on the west coast to bring in the FLNG plants. The natural gas potential in BC is up in the Horn River Basin, and that's onshore. So no, FLNG will not be a player in Canada in the near term.
Marin, is there a website people can go to see some of your research and developments in the industry?
Sure. We have a weekly free publication at kcresearch.com. And if you just click the energy buttons there to take you to my research, you can see what I've done, and it's a decade worth of research.
After the break, Danielle Park on This Week in Money.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
This Week in Money is archived online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. My guest is Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investments Incorporated. Welcome very much to This Week in Money, Danielle.
Thanks, Jim.
The European Central Bank had a meeting, and the result, the U.S. dollar increases in value. How does that affect the Canadian dollar?
Well, the euro broke down through 130, a level it's been above for the past couple of years, and broke under that today on the news that the ECB was cutting their rates, which had already been basically nil, to nil and negative, more nil I call it, and negative in some cases. So you saw capital flowing out of the currency markets, out of the euro and back toward the U.S. dollar, which is surging over 1%. The U.S. dollar is now back at the level it was in the summer of 2012, Jim. So 2 years ago, the U.S. dollar was about 84 on the U.S. index, and that was before the last iteration of the Fed's QE, when they announced they were going to do QE forever, and the dollar had weakened at that point. Well, now it's broke back above that, and indeed the QE program in the U.S. is ending supposedly in October, so next month. And it just means that this trend of strengthening dollar as the relatively best currency or the relative safe haven to a lot of these problem areas in the world continues to attract international money flows. The Canadian dollar has been in a downtrend since 2011, and the commodity story is continuing to be under pressure here, because remember that the falling U.S. dollar was a great wind beneath the wings of commodity prices during the boom phase up until 2008, and that since then, since the rebound into 11, everything's been deflating again in terms of commodity prices as the U.S. dollar strengthened. So ultimately, this is bad for the Canadian economy, which is still relatively dependent upon commodities, and so you're seeing a weakening in the Canadian currency, a downtrend that we think will continue probably. The Canadian economy is still, too dependent on that one sector. And as I've said before, I think the overinvestment boom in the commodity space really ended in the 08 to 11 period there, and is in now a long period of sort of mean reversion where excess gets worked out of the system. So that's going to be a headwind for the Canadian dollar. And it's going to be a headwind as well for, jobs in the country, as we see the biggest area of employment created in the past few years was, around the oil sands and around the commodity story in the West, and now you're seeing that sort of tapering off. You're having people looking for work in other parts of the country with not much success. So all these things kind of go into my concern that the Canadian economy is very vulnerable here as we go forward. there was also an interesting story that I put on the blog this week about, the Bank of Canada. And this is just, this is words to learn by or lessons to learn by, let's say, from human behavior. If you remember coming out of the credit crisis, Jim, Canada was seen as the poster child for all things conservative because we hadn't gone into the great financial crisis with the same kind of leverage in our banking system in our households. So we fared better. When the crunch came, we, had a bit more seed corn in the larder, and we had a bit more strength and resilience to come through it. But the way that we came through it was to re-stimulate the consumer to overspend on housing and non-productive assets. So we've taken on a ton of debt. And at the same time, the Bank of Canada has not required Canadian banks to have any reserve. So they've been able to literally lend out 100% of any deposits that were in the branches the past few years. And at the same time, the CMHC, the government wing of the Canadian Housing Mortgage Corp, was underwriting, the lion's share by a large amount, say 90% of the Canadian mortgages that were being taken out in the past few years. So all this goes into this portrait now of Canada on the verge of the next global slowdown as it's playing out around the world, strengthening dollar, which is U.S. dollar being bad for our main products, a weak consumer sector that's now one of the most levered in the world, a weak prospects for our housing market being as it is the most overvalued market in the world relative to many others, and you don't have a lot of reserves or resilience stored up in the banking system or the Bank of Canada for that matter. The story today was just pointing out that the Bank of Canada is far from this fortress balance sheet. It has a 0.47% capital reserve relative. Now, how you compare that to other banks, the Federal Reserve, which everyone talks about as being, not in the best of shape in the U.S. these days, thanks to QE, has a capital reserve of 1.27%. So Canada is not even half as much in terms of cash on the books, sort of strength in the hopper. So if we get into another crunch or downturn, which not if, but when, let's face it, when this begins, we don't have a lot of ammunition at the ready here. So I think this is all actually productive because we've been in this phase of central bank love that's been, just this bubble in faith in central bankers, which has been unprecedented in the past couple of years as all these magicians come out and talk about what they're going to do to stimulate the economy. So I think that the end of this phase of belief, it's been very destructive and it's been very misled. The fact that it's coming to the end of the magic tricks is actually a good thing.
And of course, you said the longer they continued quantitative easing, the bigger the crash is going to be.
Well, this is precisely it. You see, this is now the biggest leverage bubble in the history of humanity. Let's just let that settle in for a minute. We've had massive bubbles, 3 massive bubbles in the last 18 years alone, being the tech internet bubble that was at the start of the century, and then we had the housing consumer credit bubble, and now we've had this, whether you call it the stimulus bubble or the QE bubble, whatever, but you've got more leverage, more debt in the world economy, more derivatives exposure. Every level of leverage is just at unprecedented levels. You've got banks with the least reserves, because everyone was so confident that, well, not everyone, but the policymakers were so confident that they could fix a debt problem by adding more debt. So they just kept adding more debt, and we've sort of given them this blank check. They've been able to just write checks and write whatever they wanted to try and, convince everyone that no one needed to go into a pay down mode. No one needed to retrench, and consumers didn't need to rebuild the savings and all that. They could just somehow miraculously keep going on spending, even though they had no wage growth and they had poor employment. So this all just nonsense. So that, I look at the Japanese story as the sort of benchmark here, because Japan was, of course, since their housing bubble burst in '89, they've had this massive intervention phases repeatedly throughout the past 25 years. And you saw that, every time they'd roll out some new phase of QE, people would start talking about how this was the miracle cure. And in fact, in the end, it just brings forward demand from the future, spends it in the present. There's a bigger hole when you get to the future. There's less demand. There's zero interest rates. So there's misallocation of capital going on, not productive investment in the economy. People are able to spend less because the savers are getting less interest on their income, on their money. All these things are just self-defeating, and yet the world, despite the fact that Japan just this week announced another, that they have had so far negative GDP growth in 2014, negative retail sales all throughout 2014. So they're back in a very tenuous position on the verge of a recession again. And, the world is still talking about what they're going to do just like them soon, like more QE. So I think the Eurozone is, Draghi felt forced to announce something today because the Eurozone is teetering back towards deflation. The U.S. Fed's coming to the end of their bag of tricks for a while here. And I think, that the slowing trend is just going to continue, and that will ultimately clean the system out. But they've certainly prodded it up and tried to, prolong the inevitable as much as possible with all these sort of gimmicks and tricks. And it's just, as we were talking before the start of our call here, the growth areas in the economy at the moment are things like payday loans and tattoo parlors. What does that tell you? Everyone's community, if you look around, the biggest presence of new business, it tends to be in those sectors. And that's at a time, loan sharks used to be kind of behind the scenes. Now they're a major franchise. And I put that other article on payday loans gone wild this week on my blog, just talking about how, the whole, it's all connected, Jim, all of this stuff. So suppressing of financial repression through horrible interest rate policies and pushing down, buying up assets and making everything overvalued so that everything yields next to nothing, makes it so that people have less money to spend, savers have less money to spend. At the same time, you get this hoarding in the financial system and in the banking system where banks are hoarding their cash and trading it themselves. And so you've got, anyone that doesn't have money, that needs loans, that doesn't have great credit, is out trying to, sell their paychecks early to get enough money to buy food. And, in Canada we do have a cap on you can't charge more than 60% federally. Provincially they have different caps to control how much is a, quote, legal rate of interest.
60%?
60% is the federally capped limit in Canada. You can't charge more than that. Isn't that mind-boggling? But
well, Guido only charges 50%.
Well, that's exactly it. So the story that I was talking about there was that Bloomberg did this investigative piece to show that there's these, because there's statutory limits in most places for how much people can be charged on these loans. Some of the companies have moved offshore and they're offering now these loans on the internet. Well, there's no particularly governing body, or they move to a place that doesn't have a cap on the interest rate. And in some of these cases, people are being, roped into these loans, advances of money on desperate terms, and they're paying up to 600% interest. And the real kicker is that the pension funds of the world are all desperate for yield, so everybody's running around after any dollar they can find, regardless of whether it's moral, regardless of the risk to the capital, regardless of whether it's long-term self-defeating, or undermining the strength of the economy. And they found that Harvard and MIT and several of the, California, Oregon, and Maryland's pension systems had actually, through an intermediary, invested in this company that was doing these online loans for these really ridiculous, despicable terms. So it's like, I always say it matters where we get our money from. You can't just afford to take, every evil dollar in the world, because it has repercussions. And it comes back to, ultimately, as I say, gut the strength in the working class, and therefore undermine the strength of our economy, and therefore undermine everybody. And it's just it's a bad fix we found ourselves in with all this, as I say, reliance on magic tricks instead of investing in things that matter. And now people are way out on the risk curve. We see that, people that had been brutally hurt in the last two downturns are now holding the highest level of equities they've held since the peak of 2007 or the peak of 2000, Jim. So bond funds have seen big outflows in the past 2 years and a preference for these equity products, which are now, priced for perfection. So it's quite a mess. And, individuals have to really come to their senses, I think, and say, as that Sam Zell, the famous billionaire, was on CNBC this week talking about what risk is, and I thought it was awfully honest and refreshing for him to say, what's the definition of safe? He said that something doesn't go down in value. Well, people are today holding these really overvalued assets like risks, like stocks and corporate bonds and a bunch of these exotic products, thinking that they're safe and that they can live on the income provided, even if the income's low, it's a dividend yield or something. They're like, oh, well, I'll just collect the dividends and I can continue to not work or be retired early or whatever it is they're thinking. Well, once they realize that these things can drop a ton, it's going to be an extremely unnerving episode again, similar to what we saw in 2008, I think.
More with Danielle Park next on This Week in Money.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
This Week in Money is archived online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. We're speaking to Danielle Park, President of Venable Park Investments Council Incorporated. Danielle, the Fraser Institute did a study into the Canadian pension plan and found out the government has been charging us outrageous management fees for our own pension plan. That I had no idea a government would have to collect funds for managing something that's their job.
Oh, heavens, yes. Well, I didn't see that article. I don't know the rates, but there is whole committees and boards and staffs of professional money managers that work for these institutions, and they certainly do not do it for free. They're highly incented. There was a big story in the Globe and Mail about a month ago, I think, on the Ontario teachers' pension and the obsession with quarterly results. Each division, whether it's the venture capital or the fixed income division or the Canadian equity or the international equity, these teams of people are all supposed to be, allocating capital from taxpayer deposits and from member deposits, allocating this capital and making yields. Well, because yields are so low, because, as I say, everything is so overvalued and there's so little of good, attractive investment opportunities out there, they are reaching for these more and more dangerous concoctions, let's put it that way. And at the same time, the system is so screwy, Jim. It may sound like a good thing to incent people that if they make a certain percent on the money, they get a bonus. That may sound like a good way to do it, but in my experience in this business, it is not a good way to do it, because what happens is it forces people to keep reaching for risk with your capital, P.S., not with their capital, with your capital, right? It's like you're trying to sort of whip them into buy something, buy anything sort of strategy, and that is the polar opposite to anything intelligent when it comes to investing capital. You want someone to be investing capital on a very sober, risk-adjusted, objective criteria where they know exactly what they're looking for and they wait until that comes before they deploy the capital. In the systems that we have now, people are giving them all these incentives to buy something all the time. And yet, nobody wants the downside, right? So it's a very dangerous environment. 77% of people surveyed in a recent survey of people over 50 who had $250,000 of savings or more, which are considered the, quote, affluent people in most society, in North American society. So people over 50 with more than $250,000 of savings, 77% of them said that safety of principal was their primary objective. And yet we have pension funds and asset managers all over today who are allocating 50 and 60 and 70% of people's savings towards the highest risk assets, because that's how they're compensated. That's the incentive, to get the money in and to get it into the, quote, highest risk stuff, because that has the greatest potential of possible upside, but it also comes with this really high preponderance of downside. And I'm afraid that people have lost sight of that connection. So they think they can reach for the yield, they can take the risk and collect the extra 1 or 2% of income, but they don't realize the downside could be 30, 40, 50, 60% of their capital. And that's why I think we're setting up for a very disappointing period.
What about these companies that guarantee your income? You'll get 5% a year forever.
Yes, I know. There's a few people have been writing me lately saying that someone is recommending different products that are paying a guarantee of 5% or 4.6%. The thing you must always keep in mind is that everything is relative to each other. So if you have government yields in the country, the 30-year bond, for example, in the United States right now is paying 3.2%. Okay, 30-year bond, 10-year bond, 2.44. In Canada, you have sort of even lower. You have a 30-year bond at 2.66%. So what that tells you is that should be your benchmark in the sense of that's what, quote, the risk-free money is earning no more than 3%. So if someone's telling you that they're able to get you a guarantee of that means they're necessarily not buying something that's guaranteed. They're buying something that has capital risk involved. And even there, the corporate bond yields have come down so far that even the junk bond index today, which has a high default rate historically, is yielding less than 5%. So if someone tells me that they're going to get 5% on their money, first of all, I'm thinking, okay, so they're either putting them in the highest risk credits that are extremely valued at the moment, or they're reaching for some handful of, higher yielding stocks that are yielding high because they are high risk. They basically, the management have tried to incent people to stay and given them extra sweeteners and that sort of thing. So I just think it's a recipe for disaster because it goes back to that number one priority. 77% of people want to not lose money. And that is actually the right goal to have when you get savings. Once you have savings, you have something to lose. And unfortunately, they're dealing with an industry that's paid to sell them risk, that wants to look like a hero when things are going up, and who will then say to you when the downside comes, no one saw that coming, or it's not our fault, or you should have known the risk. So you cannot decouple the risk from the reward, and if you're reaching for more than the lowest risk government yields right now, then you're setting yourself up for capital risk, and there's nothing guaranteed about it, quite honestly. You could see that dividends can be stopped at any time. Management doesn't have to pay them if they get into a cash crunch in the company or they decide they need to reinvest proceeds in another way. They can certainly stop paying dividends. Many people don't understand that. And also, when you have, as I say, default in a bond, it means you're not getting your principal back. Never mind the capital. Never mind the interest income that is, only guaranteed so long as the people can pay it, but you may not even get back your principal. So again, if it sounds too good to be true, it is these days.
What about Europe where you said, again, negative interest rates? Does that mean I put money into my savings account and then I owe the bank more money on top of that?
Well, it's various rates there between the ECB and the banks themselves. There's a bunch of different discount rates and deposit rates. But yes, essentially, they don't want banks borrowing money from the central bank and then parking it back on the central bank balance sheet, which is what they've been doing. Because banks are supposed to be professional risk-reward assessors, right? So they look out at the economy and they say, where do we want to invest capital, or where do we want to lend capital? In what businesses or sectors look like a good risk reward, a good reward for the risk scenario. And sadly, in a very slow growth, falling price kind of environment, there isn't a lot of very attractive investment areas. And so banks are pulling back and saying, well, we might as well just, recycle this money either back through our own trading desks to do some speculation in various assets, or we can put money back at the ECB and collect free deposits from them, and there's no risk there. So they're trying to force banks to lend. But the problem is that we've been doing this for so many years, this whole, Keynesian idea of forced credit into the system, that credit will make an economy grow. That relationship does not hold true once you've already poisoned the economy with credit. So everyone is toxic right now with the amount of credit in households and the low savings rates and reserve ratios in all these institutions. And the answer is that you now have to build up that buffer. You can't force more credit in to force more demand. It's simply broken. The mechanism is not working. And so the more they try and do this, the worse the downside gets for us. But as I said at the beginning of the call, I'm actually getting sort of encouraged. This has been a very dark period. It's gone on for, many years now. And I think that if people can pull back and reassess their risk and build up some liquidity, build up cash, and I mean cash, not, things that are paying more and promising to be like cash. I mean actual cash. If you can build that up in this period, and sort of control yourself, I think that much better opportunities are not that far ahead here, because that which can't go on forever simply will not. And, one of the new paradigm, this belief that stimulus is going to paper over all the cracks and deficits and lack of demand in the economy, these new paradigms never end up being true over time, and you'll find that there's no such thing as a new era, and these excesses are never permanent, as Bob Farrell once wisely said.
Danielle, is there a website people can go to find out more about some of the things you've been talking about?
Sure. Well, my company website is Venable Park Investment Council at venablepark.com, but I write a free blog for anyone that wishes to read it, jugglingdynamite.com, on a daily basis.
Thanks to our guests, Marin Katusa and Danielle Park, and thank you for listening. I'm Jim Goddard for Phil Mackesy. We're back next week with more This Week in Money.
This Week in Money is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated.